are not. However, at their core, they all focus directly on observing nature and considering the natural occurrences and explaining those in numbers. In Quadrivium 2, I extend the idea of patterns by presenting students with data and deriving from the patterns equations. As Samuel Butler said, life is the art of drawing sufficient conclusions from insufficient premises. Students are fairly used to the idea of patterns in creation. This is a concept that most math and science classes discuss early and often, and with good reason. With the study of statistics, students begin to see and explain the patterns of humanity, both in form and action. Students see that there are universal norms to nature as well as areas where the majority resides while we study the bell-shaped curve. They learn that events can be related without being causal while learning correlation, and they learn how to present this information in concise medium of graph and how to be critical of this information in order to not be deceived. We live in a time that attacks the truth, and our students and children need to be armed with the ability to question and consider the information that's being presented to them. We read a book called How to Lie with Statistics by Daryl Huff and consider the ways that information, mostly from 1960s advertising, can be stretched and manipulated without officially being changed. We look at the ideas of selectively picking the mode over the mean to talk about an average, or using things like a nonlinear axis in a graph to give a different view of the growth or loss of a topic. And these are tactics that our students need to be aware of. And it's a fairly short book and discusses statistical concepts without a lot of computation methods and could provide students with an awareness of statistical methods, even if your curriculum doesn't include or have time to include specific statistical instruction. So it does give a good overview of some of these ideas that are helpful for them so that they don't get deceived. Trigonometry is a wonderful tool to teach students a key concept of mathematics and of life. If a problem seems too complex, break it into something smaller and simpler that you know how to deal with. When students need to find the side of an obtuse triangle, they are able to draw on the properties of a right triangle to help them attack something more complicated. We also consider how perspective can distort our understanding as we take a look at the differences between plane and spherical trigonometry. Students learn that if they aren't working from the correct worldview, they can easily come to incorrect conclusions, whether this involves navigation based on the spherical nature of the earth or the foundational nature of the church and families in our communities. We then consider geometry. We often think of lines, angles, and shapes in this topic, especially triangles, but geometry can have a deeper effect on our students if we push them beyond that. With Euclid, students have a marvelous model of how mathematical arguments are structured. In fact, it's more than a model, it's the standard. Euclid shows how all arguments should begin with definitions, common sense, build to propositions which grow to more complex propositions, but they're always based on previously proven principles. In the beginning, these propositions are simple and have simple subjects, like triangles, something that's easy to define and understand. Euclid allows students to come to grips with heavily structured arguments using ideas that are familiar, safe, and easy, like triangles. But in Quadrivium 3, we go beyond the triangles. Once students have gained an understanding of the Euclidean format, we extend the lesson on triangles to the world around us. I give my students news articles, and we consider how and if the author defines their terms, makes unsupported assumptions, or skips steps in their reasoning. Students finish their formal study of Euclid by writing a persuasive essay, and those who constructed correct proofs about triangles are generally better at making a strong essay, a strong persuasive essay. They are able to use Euclid's methods to create compelling arguments for something that is not concrete and objective. Studying geometry trains students to consider, manipulate, and discuss abstract ideas. Plato wrote, "Geometry will draw the soul toward truth and create a soul of philosophy." After students see how Euclid's methods can be applied to the world outside of parallel lines, Dr. Tallmon joins us, and we look at the key factors of argumentation and push students to consider questions that men have considered throughout time as we read Plato and Aristotle. Sorry, here's a chunk. Okay, in modern physics and math classes, we're lumping astronomy in with physics because it basically is, students learn concepts separate from one another. Math classes use physics examples, but they're simplified down to plug and chug, find the equation that fits the situation, plug in your answer, plug in your numbers, and get an answer. In contrast, physics classes use math, but they often use math as something even less than a tool. When someone uses a hammer to hammer a nail, they know they're using a hammer and not a drill, but oftentimes in modern physics classes, students don't even know why they're using one equation over another. In addition, any math they learn is taught as an equation that just needs to be used, and it's not taught as the logical consequence of the material and concepts that they're working with. In Quadrivium 4, students learn pre-calculus alongside astronomy. This means that they learn about the beauty and working of the solar system, they learn about the math that was used by Kepler and Copernicus, and all of those who spent their time studying the same beauty and workings. Students get to see the context of math and recognize the need for concepts such as trigonometry and calculating areas because they are necessary for finding the position of the heavenly bodies. Conversely, students also learn about the motion of the planets and recognize the need for new math and can see the derivation of the math to satisfy the needs of the topic. Thus, students get to see the cycle of knowing math to understand a topic, which furthers their understanding of the topic, which needs more math to understand it fully, and that leads to mathematical derivations. In a modern educational setting, students never get to see the interplay between math and science. In Quadrivium 5, this view of the interplay between math and science is compounded. Students learn about the projectile motion and average velocity in Quadrivium 4, but in Quadrivium 5, they encounter the question of how do we find the instantaneous velocity? Thus, they're introduced to calculus, whose creation came directly from Newton and Leibniz, asking the very same question. Later on, they come to why do things move, which leads them to needing forces from physics and vectors from math. Then they ask what makes moving objects different from stationary objects, which leads them to energy and a very basic introduction to differential equations. Learning physics and math in this way has a multitude of benefits, but I believe the primary benefit is this. The students learn to look for relationships between things that may appear unrelated. For example, if you throw an object, the kinematic equation from physics will describe that motion. To a student from a public school, they would innately understand how an object will travel because they've been throwing things their whole life. And they would know that there is an equation that relates to that specific situation. But if they saw the equation separate from the context of the problem, their mind would probably not turn to thoughts of thrown objects, but rather to a high school math class that they probably didn't like. In contrast, students that have learned about object motion in a quadrivium setting will have learned from the perspective of, here's a ball thrown through the air. The shape makes a parabola. I know how to make a parabola. I can use math to describe this. Because of this, the student will be able to see the equation outside of the context of the object being thrown and see that it is the same situation. It's not just describing it, it's not just related to it. It is the equation itself is the situation of the thrown object. By learning to recognize this and see that thing A and thing B are not just related, but the same concept in a different form, students can then apply this to all aspects of life. They can approach difficult situations and synthesize information that others would consider unrelated in order to solve a problem. We put these 4 classes together, and students are taught many equations and many facts, but also how to consider the source information that they're being given, whether or not the data will apply evenly to everyone, and how that data would be extended. You can take a complicated problem and break it down into manageable pieces, and that perspective of someone making an observation is crucial. All arguments need to be based in a shared understanding, and you need to consider each logical step along the way, and areas that can seem unrelated can have relationships if you look for them. When most of the world, certainly in public school, considers advanced mathematics, it often thinks of the practical world: calculus, statistics, physics, chemistry, and engineering. After all, what's the point of all these STEM programs I keep hearing about if students can't make a living with them and do something? Well, my husband is an engineer, and he recently spent 2 years mentoring new engineers who thought they were calculators. They thought their job was to take a number, run it through the equation, and to put out a number. He explained to them, after many conversations, that there are computer programs who do that, and that is not their job. Their job is to know how that number applies to the situation. So often today, our world functions with a divorced view of mathematics, and only one side is deemed important. Schools need to provide students with good mathematical instruction in order to create good practitioners of math and science. Good practitioners of math and science know a lot of math and science, and it takes time to learn that. But you don't need to think about it too hard. You don't need to memorize formulas. After all, you can just look those up. Just make sure that when you're presented with a number, you can put it in the equation. Students get stuck becoming receptacles who don't know what they contain, when, or how to use it. And if you stop there, you might do well at a trivia night, but you probably won't make a first-rate scientist. Since Newton and Leibniz gifted the world with a highly functional and practical fields of physics and calculus, we have shifted our views towards the practical side of mathematics. But let's consider some other great mathematicians. If you say the name Descartes, most people, though maybe not in this room, will probably jump to "I think, therefore I am" before they consider the Cartesian coordinate system, which may be fair considering geometry was an appendix anyway. Depending on who you talk to, Leonardo da Vinci is either considered a painter or an inventor, though he's reported to have said that those who hadn't studied math shouldn't even start reading his works. Plato is generally remembered as a student of Socrates and the author of the Republic, but we shouldn't forget that the 5 Platonic solids are named after him. And even Pythagoras, who is revered as a mathematician, considered numbers as having divine properties, if not being divinities themselves. And actually, Leibniz was also a philosopher and a political advisor, and Newton published several papers on religion. The practice of constantly struggling with abstract concepts of mathematics, finding new or at least different ways to say the same thing, trig identities, constantly searching for proof and reason, like we do in geometry, and explaining the physical phenomenon from the motion of the planets to the path of a thrown ball, calculus, provide the perfect jumping off point for deeper consideration of everything. Mathematics perfectly primes our students for the study of philosophy. Of course, there are many prominent philosophers who have not been mathematicians. You can still find patterns in the worlds of history and literature that will cause you to question the nature of creation. In these fields, you are studying the works and actions of the masterwork, humanity, of our Creator. By using mathematics and science to examine the work of creation directly, we get a slightly different view of God's world. It's still a sinful view. Adam damaged the world just as much as he damaged humanity. And we need to help our students understand that math and science give us a fuller view of God's creation and don't just prepare us for STEM fields. Thank you. And now Dr. Tallmon is going to come and elaborate or take a different approach.
You would expect that people that collaborated on a class like this would have dovetailed their presentations. Au contraire. We, in fact, didn't collaborate. She was moving back to the States, and we just kind of got our assignment and did our own thing. So let me build a bridge now, if I may. When we got together, we spent hours talking about creative ways to merge the discussion and build a bridge from trivium to quadrivium and discuss ethics in geometry, because that approach suggested itself to Mrs. McCreary as she was reading Euclid. There are a number of passages where ethics comes up from a geometric point of view. Well, come to find out, if you start reading the Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle, proportion, for example, is all over that. So friendship is approached from the notion that we ought to have reciprocity in our treatment of friends and so forth. And it quickly occurred to us that that's not really adequate for a Lutheran point of view on how we treat our friends and neighbors, right? So it gave us plenty to talk about and to consider, but it wasn't necessarily that mathematical. In fact, it wasn't very mathematical at all, but that's okay because I'm not either. So I was the guest lecturer, and we just trundled down the path and enjoyed a discussion of key passages in the Nicomachean Ethics, which will suggest themselves to you as you read it for yourself. But also, if you would like some specific citations, please email Mrs. McCreary and she'll provide those for you. See what I did there?
Yeah.
But anyway, we found several places where we could ponder for a while how it played out, the relationship between ethics and geometry played out in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. But once we started talking about ethics in the Nicomachean Ethics and friendship, I really had to introduce a strand of rhetoric and ethics, because I was, as a matter of fact, teaching Rhetoric 3 at the time, and we do discuss, or Rhetoric 2 at the Wittenberg Academy, and we discuss the Nicomachean Ethics in that briefly, because I teach rhetoric as speaking the truth in love to my neighbor to persuade them toward the good with their good in view. And so what I'm going to talk about today is an elaboration of that view of rhetoric, the ethics in and of rhetoric. And in order to spring into it, I want to have us focus on a passage from C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, page 13. St. Augustine defines virtue as ordo amoris, the ordinate condition of the affections in which every object is accorded that kind of degree of love which is appropriate to it. Aristotle says that the aim of education is to make the pupil like and dislike what he ought. When the age for reflective thought comes, the pupil who has been thus trained in ordinate affections or just sentiments will easily find the first principles in ethics, but to the corrupt man, they will never be visible at all, and he can make no progress in that science. Plato before him had said the same. The little human animal will not at first have the right responses. It must be trained to feel pleasure, liking, disgust, and hatred at those things which really are pleasant, likable, disgusting, and hateful. My emphasis today is twofold. First and foremost, the role of rhetoric in inclining the soul toward the true, the good, and the beautiful. We will first differentiate the techne, or craft knowledge, art of rhetoric, from the faculty of discovery inherent to rhetorical invention that is logically prior to the art of crafting arguments. The obvious role of rhetoric is understood in terms of invention, namely the art of composing persuasive speeches and papers. Today, I wish to consider how the process of crafting papers and speeches, and then of delivering them eloquently, all combine in myriad ways to affect the affections. More of that in a moment. The not so obvious role has to do with the cultural role of rhetoric. For that, I'd like to just show you, wake up. There. This is the Rhetoric Ring, rhetoricring.com. This is the website that I composed after my first visit to the Consortium for Classical Lutheran Education in order primarily to help classical educators understand rhetoric and dialectic. So if you go to Helps for Classical Educators and then click here, this is a tutorial on teaching in tandem, dialectic and rhetoric in order to cultivate wisdom and eloquence. First thing first, the focus here is teaching dialectic and rhetoric in order to shape the habits of the students who are ready for it, in order to think quickly on their feet, to listen perceptively, to listen with empathy to others, and then to respond with precision and eloquently to what's being said. So it has to do with shaping the skill sets of the students, not simply acquisition of head knowledge. Got the difference? Okay. And then down at the very bottom, if you scroll down here, it says many, many more resources. This is my repository of basically, I guess, my life's work. And the paper that I'm delivering today is available right here. I'm not going to get through all of it, so you can find it here, okay, in PDF format. But to go back here, there is also, on the Rhetoric Ring, Weaver's Top 10 Essays. This is my shrine to Richard M. Weaver. My mentor did his doctoral dissertation on Richard M. Weaver, and I've been fixated on him my whole life. And one of the things that Weaver writes that comes in at number 3 on this list is the cultural role of rhetoric. I mentioned the cultural role of rhetoric about 3 minutes ago, and I just want to read the conclusion of this to you. It's a brilliant essay. You should read it. He says, in brief, the dialectician of our day has no adequate theory of man. Lacking such a theory, he of course cannot find a place for rhetoric, which is the most humanistic of all the disciplines. Rhetoric speaks to man in his whole being and out of his whole past, and with reference to values which only a human being can intuit. The semanticists have in view only a denatured speech to suit a denatured man. Okay, the general semanticists, S.I. Hayakawa and that school of thought, were driven to scientize language in order to do away with misunderstandings, because they held the presumption that misunderstandings lead to war. And so they thought they could wipe out war. They were motivated in the post-war era, after 2 major world wars, to do away with war through linguistic means. And that meant stripping language of all of its nuance and the spirit and the implication, and just reduce language to pure notation. So Weaver said, what you're going to do, because language is a vehicle for spirit, you're going to have a denatured speech for a denatured man, because language shapes us. Got it? So that's his critique of the general semanticists. And so he says that's what they'll end up with. And then he says theirs is a major intellectual error committed by supposing that they were going to help man by bringing language under the surveillance of science. There is never any question that rhetoric ultimately will survive this scientific attack. The pity is that the attack should ever have been made at all, since proceeding from contempt for history and ignorance of the nature of man, they must produce confusion, skepticism, and inaction. In the restored man, Dialectic and rhetoric will go along hand in hand as the regime of the human faculties intended that they should do. That is why the recovery of value and of community in our time calls for a restatement of the broadly cultural role of rhetoric. All right, that's all I really wanted to share with you at this time from the rhetoric ring. But it's the idea that the regime of the human faculties, as he says, is such that dialectic and rhetoric are supposed to go hand in hand. And I think that's how I teach dialectic and rhetoric, as a means of cultivating wisdom and eloquence. I'll proceed on with the paper. It is my prayer that you will walk away from this session with a full understanding of why this knowledge is vital for those whose earnest desire is that our children follow in the ways we believe, teach, and confess. The sensibilities one cultivates as one learns rhetorical and dialectical arts in tandem equip one to embrace a faith like ours. So what differentiates our faith worldview from that of others? Orthodox Lutherans are sacramental. Orthodox Lutherans are creedal. Orthodox Lutherans embrace mysteries. We are not rationalistic. We embrace both and, not either or. That's kind of funny. I just made an either or out of that. Orthodox Lutherans are confessional. Our calling card is, this is most certainly true. These differences require that our souls be inclined in a particular way from our youth. In short, any old sort of education will not do. Classical Lutheran liberal arts education is what's needed. Even at that, any old classical liberal arts education will not suffice. Why? Because a robust focus in the upper grades on rhetorical and dialectical arts, aiming at cultivation of wisdom and eloquence, not simply head knowledge about rhetoric and logic, make all the difference. This is a great springboard for a rabbit trail on right education. Aristotle said the right education is to be both pained by and to love what we ought. The rightly turned soul is oriented toward the city of God. I had a scripture at the outset, Psalm 84:5. Blessed are those whose strength is in you, in whose heart are the highways to Zion. The rightly turned soul is oriented toward the city of God. As mentioned above, we first need to understand the distinction between crafting arguments, the techne of rhetoric, and the heuresis that precedes it, which is rhetorical reasoning. When they are young, we drill our scholars, do catechesis, utilize rote memorization, but the soul is not fully inclined, as everyone realizes, until the student makes the truth his own. When does that happen? During the rough and tumble of debate, attempting to persuade others in love, coming into contact with competing ideas, refuting them with mutual respect and intellectual integrity. This, by the way, is my rationale for the importance of having in one's curriculum what is commonly known as speech communication. A robust longitudinal exposure to thinking quickly on one's feet, listening with empathy, responding appropriately with imagination, and so on. Composition, well taught, will get you partway there. It takes speech and debate to become both wise and eloquent. This is why in Wisdom and Eloquence, Littlejohn and Evans recognize the role of rhetoric in character development. More recently, James Smith observed in You Are What You Love, a book entitled You Are What You Love, our hearts are calibrated through imitating exemplars and being immersed in practices that over time index our hearts to a certain end. We learn to love, then not primarily by acquiring information about what we should love, but rather through practices that form the habits of how we love. These sorts of practices are pedagogies of desire, not because they are like lectures that inform us, but because they are rituals that form and direct our affections. Smith observes how liturgical practices shape the soul. By virtue of our heritage, we have a perfect blend of catechesis, liturgies, classical content, and pedagogy to shape the souls of our students. Consider the importance of rhetorical studies in cultivating the imagination required to live the Christian life in the fashion Smith suggests, sacramentally. In order to cultivate imagination, scholars will learn to understand the interplay of rhetorical figures and poetic and the combined effect of these on memory, emotions, will, and imagination. They will understand what moves the soul and why. So how does that work? Let me break it down for you very briefly. One of the things you'll find on my rhetoric ring is a listing of 3 courses that comprise, in my opinion, a triumvirate of fundamentals in rhetorical arts that rightly constitute the rhetoric stage, grades 9 through 11. I teach fundamentals of public speaking, argumentation and debate, and then advanced public speaking in a traditional liberal arts fashion to cultivate wisdom and eloquence. In the Wittenberg Academy curriculum, they are Rhetoric 1, 2, and 3. That's what those classes are. Richard Weaver concludes the cultural role of rhetoric by observing that, that's what I read you earlier, by observing that dialectic and rhetoric will go together in the restored man as the regime of human faculties intended that they should. So that's a design argument in case you didn't pick it up. It's just a little bit masked because he had a popular audience in mind. I teach fundamentals of public speaking, argumentation, and debate, and advanced public speaking in traditional liberal arts fashion to cultivate wisdom and eloquence. Taken together, these 3 courses constitute an integrated approach to the study and practice of rhetoric. In the process of learning to practice rhetoric artfully, the student will also learn to reason with precision, spot faulty logic, exercise insight and forethought, deliberate with insight, and use language masterfully. He will learn to think both logically and analogically, in short, to instruct, persuade, and delight audiences, habitually employing both wisdom and eloquence. The key to this approach is that in each case, both in terms of the logical and stylistic elements of instruction, in each case, the theory is taught to prepare the student to excel in an upcoming assignment. So each unit of the course entails laying a theoretical foundation, providing some nuts and bolts, and then an opportunity to practice. Theory, nuts and bolts, practice. It's a layered approach to learning. Each unit of the course entails laying a theoretical foundation. They do a good bit of research. They're exposed to great speeches. They focus intently on style and pathos and are ultimately invited to do a speech in which their voice emerges. The pedagogical principle of multum non multa, much not many, cover in more depth fewer things, is a key pedagogical principle here. We have to learn to put away the fire hose. Circle concepts, learn in stages, bring to bear the theory on an upcoming assignment. Design units of instruction with this in mind. This particular learning cycle may take about 2 years. Again, this is about cultivating mental habits, not test-taking skills. It's more nuanced and dynamic than mastery of content. Learning to operate comfortably in this arena cultivates in the natural course of things insight, discernment, imagination, prudence, foresight, mental discipline, and mental dexterity. In short, it equips one to handle truth. More to our point today, in the handling of those truths, one examines the foundations of one's faith and one's political orientation, one's inclinations, as it were. So we have arrived at a really commonsensical principle that the pursuit of truth shapes the soul Only now we have a little more clear picture of how rhetoric is highly implicated in that sort of pursuit, insofar as one attempts to persuade one's neighbor, in the process, persuading oneself. But we are not bodiless machines moved by logic alone. We are incarnated minds and souls moved by vivid images and inspired by beauty. One of the beautiful things about rhetoric is that it appeals to persons in their whole being. Crafting fine speeches and papers that are designed to move one to dream big dreams or think big thoughts require finely honed aesthetic sensibilities. Learning to use language artfully to appeal not only to the mind but also to the imagination and the heart is a humanizing activity for both speaker and audience. Albert Einstein's quip that imagination is more important than knowledge bespeaks the importance of style in rhetoric. You can muster all the logic at your disposal, but if you fail to move your audience, you will never persuade them. The end of persuasion is action, and in order to move persons to action, you've got to move the soul. In De Augmentis, Sir Francis Bacon defines rhetoric as, quote, the application of reason to imagination for the better moving of the will. Style is about crafting strong mental imagery and building to a verbal crescendo by artfully, strategically using figures of speech. The canon of style is about introducing to one's argumentation both poetry and aesthetics. It's about communicating truth with beauty and grace, which adds impulse to the truth. Rhetoric in the final analysis moves the soul toward the good. So we teach our students to preside over their art with secure mastery. We teach them not dry, sterile communication, but to combine good reasons with passion and vivid imagery to pique the imagination, which stirs the emotions, which moves the will. So rhetoric is a great power and must be wielded with grace, decorum, propriety, proportion, and measure. So when it comes to the fanciful dimensions of rhetoric, the scholar is constrained by the dictates of good judgment and good taste. Mastering oratory requires one both to be good, to establish trust, and to aim at the good by speaking truth. The former entails the goodness cultivated within the rhetor, virtue. The latter, that from which and to which our rhetoric points. Trust is a precondition of persuasion. Why would one allow oneself to be persuaded by one whose word cannot be trusted? In Book 12 of his Institutes of Oratory, Quintilian argues that an orator must be a good man because he's educated to lead, and a leader cannot create civic virtue through good laws and by praising virtue if he has not cultivated it in himself, or if his judgment is warped. To speak credibly on affairs of state, the speaker must be credible. He must love both the state and its citizens. In this postmodern age, our students need to be educated in this fashion, simply to hold on to the sort of faith that we believe, teach, and confess. What sort of faith is that? It's Christological, it's sacramental, it's creedal, and liturgical. A particular sort of faith requires a particular sort of education. Luther and company understood this. We are rediscovering it. The Lutheran faith is based resolutely on the words and works of Christ. Other faith worldviews within Christendom are much less focused on Christ and more focused on moralism, mysticism, or rationalism. Please see Jean Edward Veith's Spirituality of the Cross. Our creedal faith is based on absolute truth. Unless one believes this, one shall surely perish. This is unequivocal. Our doctrine is based on the creeds and documents codified in our Book of Concord, were forged by great theological minds in the crucible of conflict through the ages. It is most certainly true that to be brought fully into communion with those minds, one must possess a mind that is up to the task. The word and sacraments are central to our doctrine, and especially in a rationalistic and empiricist culture, sacramental Christianity is an acquired taste. One must learn to participate in it, so to speak. Why? Because it requires imagination and figuration to bridge the seen and unseen, this world and the world to come. Our rites and worship practices are fruits of a heritage that goes back literally to an age that predates Christianity. They are classical. See Art Just's Heaven on Earth. Our faith worldview is ancient and therefore out of step entirely with the postmodern age in which we live. The catechesis our students receive helps them have eyes to see and ears to hear. The particular kind of truth they encounter in the sermons of our church. They grasp more readily than the child educated differently that Christ is at the center, that we are his workmanship, and that we walk in the works he prepared for us to do. Smith elucidates precisely why cultivating imagination is a natural outcome of the approach to language arts we teach, that it actually helps our children fully hear and inwardly digest God's word. A prayer in 1 Kings chapter 8 is apropos. The Lord our God be with us as he was with our fathers. Let him not leave us nor forsake us, that he may incline our hearts unto him, to walk in all his ways and to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, which he commanded our fathers. And also Psalm 141:4. Incline not my heart to any evil thing. Our creeds and confessions are written in a distinctively classical style. That style reflects what Smith calls, in a particularly striking turn of phrase, quote, the liturgies that govern our rhythms, unquote. There remains now only a single small step to understand the cultural role of rhetoric as explicated in the essays of Richard Weaver. As we engage in rhetoric to persuade persons about surface propositions, we speak from presuppositions regarding those values that make the proposal either attractive or repulsive, praise or blameworthy. In a nutshell, as we teach our neighbor to love what we ought, or to be repulsed by what he ought, we also invite him below the level of discourse, in the tacit realm, to see the world in a particular way. The cultural role of rhetoric has to do with what my mentor dubbed deep rhetoric, those taken for granted presuppositions that, though out of discourse, must nonetheless be assumed in order to make sense out of the picture of the world being developed. They are value propositions that are powerful precisely because they dictate what is to be valued when valuation is not made the problematic, because the focus is on a surface proposal that involves, in some sense, changing the status quo. There exists a fundamental agreement that binds together all who adhere to these unspoken values. Values like one's word is one's bond, or do unto others as you would have others do unto you, or a pillar of strong character is trustworthiness. The bottom line is that the cultural role of rhetoric is to simultaneously cultivate cultural cohesion and to also provide a vehicle for cultural change, permanence, and change. In our day, where dissension, division, and disintegration threaten to dissolve our very social bonds, the cultivation of cultural cohesion is increasingly important. We are increasingly fragmented. Look, I'm running out of time, so just go to the rhetoric ring, click on Weaver's Top 10, and read the cultural role of rhetoric. If you'd like, I'll give a little tutorial, preferably over adult beverages, before we part company Thursday. Thank you all for your kind attention. We definitely need to entertain some questions, and we have more time than I thought we would have, so that's good, because we glossed over all of the nuts and bolts. So I started very briefly trying to make up for that by talking about what we did when we covered the Nicomachean Ethics of Aristotle alongside Euclid, portions of Euclid's geometry. So, as I said, one topic led to another, and we ended up talking about the ethics of rhetoric. And we did discuss very briefly how rhetoric shapes the individual, how there's an ethical dimension to rhetoric. It's not just about learning how to give a good speech. And so that was my focus today, but I'm sure you would like to hear it. And we really didn't want to just give a hyper-intellectual presentation about these issues. We would like to accommodate your interests more in terms of takeaways, nuts and bolts, hands-on teaching. So that's what this time is for. And thank God we have 20 minutes for it. I think that's miraculous.
I missed, I think, the first part of yours.
Oh, okay. That's fine.
But I guess what I'm hoping to take away, my oldest son is going into high school. And my husband teaches the math portion. So you talked a little bit about how math is going to integrate into the rhetoric stage and affects all the other, maybe just some practical ways, because, in our homeschool, those two are a little bit divorced.
Right.
He teaches one and I teach the other.
Okay.
So how to, like Dr. Tallmon said, bridge that and make it more applicable, I guess. I don't know if you understand that.
Yeah. I'm trying to think of how to phrase it to you as the one who's not teaching the math.
Right. And I do understand math. That's
Right,
not
right.
why I'm not teaching it. It's because he wants to teach math.
Sure.
And
Yeah, absolutely.
it takes a little bit of burden off me.
Yeah. And one of the things that Dr. Tallmon and I talked about as we were getting ready to have our grand experiment of Quadrivium 3 is that sometimes you just have to tell kids, look, this is what we're learning, and we're going to talk about spherical trigonometry versus plane trigonometry or whatever it is, and this is how it applies to something else. Now let's explore how it does that. So sometimes it is just a simple declarative statement, this is what I want you to get out of this, and we're going to do a lot of math practice so that way you can see how get all the examples, and you can see that, yes, really, if you're looking at the world as a sphere versus as a flat plane, things really are different and it does matter, but also let's consider, this article and what might be that person's perspective and how would our perspective differ. So sometimes, at the rhetoric stage, it is more deliberate, I would say, than maybe what I presented yesterday when it's just a comment here or there with the grammar and logic stage. So I don't know if that's enough or if that's helpful.
You could expand on it more unless people have other questions.
I have a related question.
Sure.
So, it's great that math, like the whole thing with sphere and plane, how it relates
Sure.
to other things. Have you found as a teacher anything inherently Christian that you've been able to teach with math in and of itself?
In and of itself, between the equations?
Yeah, just in your teaching math, have you been able to find any inherently Christian thing within the teaching math, or have you found more it's in how you use how they've been changed with the math and other things?
Yeah, I mean, there is the kind of universal aspect of math that it is always true. Euclid, it was true when Euclid wrote it, it's still true when we have it now. The quadratic formula worked when it was discovered, it works now. It doesn't change with time, but it's more pulling those kinds of parallels and those kinds of, I guess, using math as an analogy instead of, here's the, quadratic formula or whatever, and because of that, therefore Christ. I haven't found anything like that.
No, yeah.
But I mean, there are a lot of examples of look at all these really cool things that we can do with math. Also, have you noticed this? Have you noticed that both tree branches and the alveoli in our lungs are basically models of fractals. And why do we have, hi Pastor Kane, why would we have such beauty in the world? What's the purpose of that? And yes, there's purpose to the surface area and things like that with the alveoli, but just those kinds of wonderings is what has been the easiest for me to draw upon with my students.
There's one train of thought about pedagogy in classical education that true rigor comes from directly and with great clarity pushing deeper and deeper and deeper into the subject matter. And I think there's actually a lot to be said for decentering the approach so that you see things in the periphery that relate and then making those connections. And that can lead to more epiphanies in some instances. So it's not always about pushing and digging deeper and deeper in a direct way. The depth can come in surprising ways.
Right.
If you're imaginative.
Right. It's not about how many equations do you know. Do you know all of these different math theories? It's how does this apply to other things? We don't get the wonder of science by knowing every scientist. We don't have to read every single book in the world to get the benefits of literature. It's
Right.
making the connections between the two.
And that leads back to multa, non-multa. You don't have to cover more and more material. And some people are just driven that way, and that they equate quality learning with
A lot.
masses of learning.
Yeah.
And that's not always the case. And it's brutal. It's not child's play. And that was Luther's favorite catchphrase when he was talking about education. That's not frivolity. It's love of learning, joy in learning.
So when you're teaching rhetoric, do you try to enable the student to use that or to contemplate when they're doing other subjects so they can vocalize and express themselves clearly, no matter what the subject, not just for this class or this theory. So they're not just thinking, oh, what theory is this now?
When you're teaching rhetoric and logic directly, the objective is always to inform your habits to carry into all your subjects. Your ability to speak intelligibly and articulately and with some perceptivity about any question.
Going back to about math, your son, you're homeschooling, we homeschool. Your son, is this the approach, why do I need to do math, or is it why do I have to do the rhetoric part when it has nothing to do with math, or what was your question?
Well, I just, I guess I hadn't ever really thought about, what you were saying when I came in, that, trigonometry, I love math, and both my boys enjoy math too, just for the sake of math. And we all know how math is important in the world, no matter what, what occupation you go into. My oldest son loves music, so obviously there's a connection there with math. But I hadn't thought of it beyond, hadn't thought about how math applies in the rhetoric stage. That it's not just learning trigonometry to pass a test.
Right.
So, so I was intrigued, but I couldn't write down fast enough what you were saying.
I just thought of a nice way to articulate that the pursuit of knowledge is an end in itself. Doesn't mean you have to pursue each discipline in a silo by itself. In fact, the real beauty of classical education is to learn to see relationships and patterns. That's the upshot of Mrs. McCreary's presentation, really.
That's right.
It makes it come alive. And people that learn to think with imagination across disciplines and make connections are highly valued if they have to have utilitarian value for the learning. That would be it.
I have a question, like, what do you feel most equipped you to be able to teach math in this way and to make these connections? You know, like I was trained to be a mathematician,
Right.
and you know, like somehow I miss a lot of this, and you know, it's exciting and everything,
Sure.
and I'd like to learn more of it. And I'm just curious, like what.
It's the I feel it's kind of the standard. I read the old books.
Mhm.
I read Euclid, I read Euler, I have Diophantus's algebra, and then I also read Plato and Aristotle, and all of it together because I was in all of it. It all came together.
Okay.
So, yeah, I mean, and my husband, who's the engineer, who's very practical, he's like, well, why don't you just use the book that we used? It's like, oh, because it's got a certain perspective, you know, talking about, going back to the plenary speech, the plenary talks, there is a certain chronological snobbery, and you kind of miss some of those connections.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's what it was, because I remember you here yesterday.
Yes.
Okay, yeah, so you know my math story and
Right.
how much math I have.
Right. So were you educated classically then?
Well, yes and no. I went to public schools. Officially, no, I wasn't. I went to state schools. My mother, who is now spending this week being a grandmother, has been involved with CCLE since the beginning. And she is very well acquainted with Dr. Tallmon, Pastor Kane. And she has been talking to me about this, using me as a sounding board since I was about 15. So officially no, but kind of yes.
Informally, yeah.
Informally, but also not in the field of math.
Right.
Because my mom is a teacher, and specifically first grade, so that's her focus also.
I want to interject briefly before we call on the gentleman in the back, but I have expertise in Aristotelian ethics, and I read the Nicomachean Ethics backwards and forward, but I never paid attention to the geometric principles that are replete throughout it. But as soon as we started doing it with that in view, it was like, wow, I had no idea you had that mathematical an orientation toward things like friendship and ethical treatment of
Right.
others. And I was like, boy, this is rubbish.
And Socrates, or in Plato, Socrates uses a lot of mathematical illustrations. It's
Yeah.
like, remember there's the square, and we're going to add numbers, and he uses those as analogies.
Lutherans aren't as calculating with their friends as he was suggesting you should be.
So, for your part, going back to the old books makes perfect sense. For Dr. Tallmon's part, I'm wondering if all you have, when you look back historically for what you're interested in here, do you only find examples? I mean, has anybody ever, the way I understand this, the Quadrivium was subjects, not necessarily method. So, I mean, has anybody ever, do you have any place to go, or are you the first ones who have thought about this stuff?
We view ourselves as being groundbreaking on this because for how many years, Pastor Kane, have we been thinking we've got to bridge the trivium and quadrivium? It's too tidy the way it's presented all the time.
It was part of the planning for 12.
12, okay, so for years
All at
we've been
once.
saying, let's do something like this. And then Mrs. Benson came up because she kept going like this. Mrs. Benson said, well, why don't include Quadrivium 3, why don't you try doing something maybe with ethics, or what would be a subject that would bridge them and suggest something new and fresh. So we're trying to do something new and fresh. And believe me, the only reason these presentations didn't hang together more is this is our first pass. We're just stretching here. We don't have many answers, but we're pretty I think we're excited for the next, we had a lovely time collaborating on it, and we're really looking forward to how we can, especially the realization that it is rubbish trying to be so mathematically driven in your friendships, and it's just so calculating that the contrast that we can draw between a Lutheran friendship and an Aristotelian friendship, we can have a lot of fun debating that.
Right, and we also talked a lot about means and extremes was another
Yeah.
topic that
I
we spent a lot of
forgot
time on with Aristotle, and he was always trying to look for the middle.
The golden mean.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes, Ms. White?
I kind of almost hate asking this question because as a homeschooling mom, we don't want to think about standardized testing.
Right.
But in New York State, there is standardized
I'm in
testing.
New York too.
Okay, and so I listened to you and I hated math, when I was
Right.
younger, because I'm more along your lines. I love the idea of language, I love the logic, I love all of those aspects. And I got to the higher level math and I didn't understand why I was doing it. So I just stopped listening to my teacher because she never explained why I was doing the equations. And I see that in my son now. And I'm doing like Saxon math, and there's already a disconnect between Saxon math and how he does his standardized testings because it's Common Core. And so when I prepare him for the standardized test, I say, okay, well, this is just what you have to do. And I would love for him to take your classes. I'm loving how you're explaining it because I think he would love it because he's getting at a place where he's not understanding the why of the math. But how is he going to do on the standardized test? I hate to even say that I have to think of that.
Yeah, I know. I'm in New York State also, and I'm having that same thought with
Yeah.
my daughter, and we're just on long division.
Yes.
So, I don't know, but maybe we can exchange information and
Okay.
have a special
Oh, I would
New York
love that.
State support group.
Yes, that would be wonderful.
This is really, what we're talking about only amounts to a diversion in the quadrivium, right?
Yeah,
It's not a major threat.
Okay.
yeah, it's not taking the place of the equations and things like that. It's an additional discussion to have
Okay.
every now and then. We're still learning all of our algebra equations. We're still learning standard deviation and correlation coefficient, which to the best of my knowledge isn't on the Common Core, and neither is any of geometry, by the way. But, we're still learning all of those standard, normal mathematical concepts.
Yes.
We're just also having additional discussions of how does that apply to friendship or to, what it means to be a good person or to have a good community or things like that.
Higher order learning, hopefully a refreshing change of pace, but not the big news.
Do you have to report your scores to the
Yes.
state? See, we have to test in Minnesota, but we don't have to supply the scores unless they're below 15 for the 15th percentile. But then even then, we don't have to supply them to the district. We just have to have a plan, an action plan if somebody.
Yeah, we have to supply a proposed curriculum
Yes.
and then have quarterly check-ins and then standardized tests at the end.
Yeah.
And if those
Very
don't
strict.
meet, checked it off, then we're not allowed to homeschool.
Right. Do you have to use the state testing or so?
Oh, that I don't know, because I've been out of the country.
No, we can use the Iowa test.
The
Oh,
Iowa.
okay.
And I, like CAT,
Yeah.
California Achievement Test, you can do that.
Yeah.
But thank you.
Do you have a list, like you were talking about the books that you read? Do you have a list of those?
I do, and
I know some of them, but I don't know all of them. I would love
Sure.
a list.
I have an email list going. If you would like to give me your email, I will just email the list to you.
Okay.
And it also has, like I discussed the How to Lie with Statistics, specifically for this age group. I discussed several other books in the session yesterday that were for, those levels. So it'll include all of
Some
that.
practical takeaways
Yeah.
out of this.
So also, if anybody else wants to join this email list and get a giant list of books, because you need more books to read, right?
Yeah.
You need a longer list. just everyone who's in here, send that email also to my husband, okay? That it's okay to have more books.
I mean, kind of was one.
Yeah, right?
Any way we can help, we're available and anxious, and especially before we leave, like I said, if we can sit down for an adult beverage and delve more deeply, we're happy to do that. And Pastor Kane brought Colchiska from Wyoming. If you don't know what that is, you need to know.
Do you mind if I
Oh,
put my,
absolutely.
thank you.
Thank you.